in a drawing room in Highbury on an ordinary evening in the autumn of 1888. A woman leans toward the mantel and strikes a match. She does this without thinking, the way a person performs any small gesture repeated 10 times a day. The gas is already lit through most of the house, but the lamp beside her reading chair still wants a taper. And so her hand finds the little box on the side table, slides it open with her thumb, and draws one slender stick of wood across the rough strip on its edge. There is a small hiss, a bead of blue fire, no larger than a fingernail, and then the steady yellow flame that will let her finish the chapter she has been reading since supper. The box itself is unremarkable to her, a plain thing printed in red and black, the words Bryant and May's Matches arranged in a neat banner across the lid, a picture of a wax vesta beside them, cheerful and small and entirely forgettable. She will use perhaps 4 or 5 sticks from it before bed, and think about none of them. It is worth pausing on that box a moment longer than she does, because in the autumn of 1888, it represents something close to a miracle of ordinary life, one so recent and so complete that almost nobody in her generation still remembers a world without it. For most of human history, making fire required flint, steel, tinder, patience, and frequently a great deal of muttered frustration. The friction match, the kind that lit with a single stroke against a rough surface, had existed for barely 60 years, refined and improved and manufactured by the millions, until a box of 100 cost a fraction of a penny and sat on every mantelpiece, in every kitchen drawer. It was cheap, it was reliable, it turned darkness into light with a motion so small and so casual that a woman reading a novel by lamplight barely noticed her own hand making it happen. The label on the box was part of the miracle too, in its own quiet way. Bryant and May, the name printed across the lid in that confident red type, had spent decades building a reputation for solidity and plain dealing. The kind of name a household trusted the way it trusted its butcher or its bank. The firm's founders had Quaker roots, men associated in the public mind with moral seriousness and fair conduct, and by 1888, the company's factory in Bow, in the East End of London, was one of the largest and most modern matchworks anywhere in the world, its machinery admired, its output vast, its dividends to shareholders the envy of other manufacturers. A box of Bryant and May's matches was not merely a useful object. It was a small, cheerful certificate of British industrial progress, sitting in the hand of a woman who had never once had reason to wonder who made it, or how, or what it had cost the person who did. Beneath that neat red label, beneath the cheerful printed banner and the small satisfying hiss of the struck match, there is a story this drawing room will never see and was never meant to see. It begins roughly 4 miles east of where this woman sits, in a factory yard on Fairfield Road in Bow, where, at very nearly that same hour, a 14-year-old girl is walking home with her hands stained the color of a ripe lemon, her jaw aching in a way she has decided not to think about too closely. Carrying in her own body the actual cost of the box on the mantel, a cost the label never printed and the woman by the lamp will never be asked to pay. This is London, 1888. Queen Victoria has reigned for 51 years. The empire spans a quarter of the globe. The docks along the Thames handle more cargo than any port on earth, and the city itself has become the largest and by most measures the wealthiest urban centre the world has ever produced. It is also, in its eastern boroughs, a place of a poverty so entrenched and so widespread that the social investigator Charles Booth would spend the final years of that decade mapping it street by street for his survey of London life and labour, colouring entire neighbourhoods black on his famous poverty maps, a shade he reserved in his own plain vocabulary for the lowest class, the vicious, and the semi-criminal. Bow, where the Bryant and May work stood, sat inside that eastern darkness, and the factory itself, respectable and modern as it looked from the road, ran on the labor of roughly 1,400 women and girls who lived inside that same poverty every single day. This video is the story of that factory and of the industry it stood at the center of, told from the inside rather than from the drawing room. We are going to walk through the gates at 6 in the morning, alongside a girl who is not a single documented individual, but a composite built carefully from the testimony, wages, ages, and daily routines of the real matchgirls of Bow. Women whose own words survive in newspaper interviews, in the records of the strike they eventually staged, and in the pamphlet that finally forced the country to look squarely at what it had been buying for pennies, at a time we are going to see the wage book and the fines that shrank it further. We are going to stand in the dipping room where the actual chemistry of a match was assembled by hand, and we are going to look directly, without spectacle and without flinching, at what that chemistry did to the bodies of the girls who breathed it for the better part of every day. We are going to meet the woman who finally wrote it all down, and we are going to watch 1,400 workers do something almost nobody expected uneducated teenage girls in 1888 to be capable of doing, which is organize themselves, walk out together, and win. Before we go further, if this kind of unhurried, honestly sourced history is something you value, if you would rather sit with the real story than the version printed on the label, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps this kind of research keep getting made. And if there is a detail tonight that stays with you after the lights are off, something about the wages or the fines or what phosphorus does to a jawbone, leave it in a comment below. I read every one, and I am always curious which parts of a story like this one land hardest with people hearing it for the first time. Let us begin then, the way most mornings at Fairfield Works actually began. Not with the finished box resting on somebody's mantle, with the girl who filled it. Her name, for the purposes of this account, is Nell Carney, and in the summer of 1888 she is 14 years old. Though she has been working a full adult shift at Bryant and May's Fairfield Works, she lives with her mother and 2 younger brothers in 2 rented rooms off Wentworth Street, a short walk from the factory gates, in a corner of Bow and Bethnal Green, where whole streets of families depended on the matchworks, or on the docks a mile south, or on the tailoring sweatshops that filled in the gaps between the two. Her father died of a lung complaint 3 winters ago, the kind of vague diagnosis that covered a great deal of East End death in that decade, and since then Nell's wage, along with her mother's occasional work taking in washing, has been most of what keeps the family fed. She is not a large girl. She stands perhaps 4 feet and 10 inches, slight through the shoulders in the way of a child who has not eaten quite enough in her growing years, and her hands, when she is not working, tend to curl slightly at rest, the fingers stiffened from the same small motion performed several thousand times a day. Her hair, worn, scraped back, and pinned close to her head, carries a faint yellowish cast at the front, where it brushes nearest to her work. A detail she has stopped noticing on herself, though she notices it instantly now on other girls. She has a chest that catches sometimes on cold mornings, a small dry cough she has carried since the previous winter, and has decided, the way people in her position generally decide about such things, not to mention to anyone who might use it as a reason to let her go. What is expected of Nell, 6 days out of every 7, is simple to state, considerable to perform. She is expected at the factory gate by 6 in the morning, sober, presentable, and ready to stand at her station for the better part of the next 14 hours, with 2 short breaks for meals that she is required. Like every other worker in her department, she is expected to fill her quota of dipped splints or finished matchboxes without complaint, to keep her bench and her feet reasonably clean by a standard the foreman alone defines, and to speak only when the work allows it, which in the dipping room, where she spends most of her days, is not often. She has one small private habit that nobody else in the family knows about. On the walk home each evening, she stops for a moment at a particular gap in a brick wall on Fairfield Road, where a stray patch of chickweed has taken root in the mortar, and touches 2 fingers to the green of it before continuing on, a small, unexplained ritual she began the week her father died. She could not have said, if pressed, exactly why the gesture mattered to her, only that some ordinary green thing, stubborn enough to grow out of brick and mortar with no one tending it at all, felt like company on a walk she otherwise made alone. This particular morning, the early days of that summer, is an ordinary working day at Fairfield Works, indistinguishable to any outside observer from the one before it or the one that will follow it. It is worth staying with that ordinariness a moment longer, because everything that happens in the chapters ahead, the wages, the fines, the phosphorus, the jaw, and eventually the walkout that would make Nell and 1,400 women like her briefly and unexpectedly famous, grew out of days exactly this unremarkable, were repeated without much variation for years at a stretch, until one particular June made all of it impossible to keep ignoring. We will follow Nell through those days now, beginning where her own mornings always began, at a gate on Fairfield Road that opened without fail at 6 o'clock. If you picture the outside of a Victorian match factory at all, you probably picture something fairly grim by instinct, a blackened brick pile with smoke pouring from a chimney, the whole building announcing its misery from the street. Fairfield Works did not look like that, and the gap between what it looked like and what it was matters more than it might seem. By 1888, Bryant and May's Fairfield Road premises in Bow were, by the standards of London manufacturing, impressive. The company had rebuilt and expanded the site across the previous 2 decades into a substantial complex of yards, warehouses, and production halls, employing at its peak somewhere in the region of 2,000 people across its various departments, the great majority of them women and girls between the ages of 13 and their early 20s. With a smaller number of adult men working as foremen, engineers, and in the heavier stages of production, such as the sawing of the wood itself. The frontage on Fairfield Road carried a certain civic confidence to it, brick and stone laid out with the same architectural seriousness a bank or a school might have received, because Bryant and May, as a firm, cared a great deal about how the outside world perceived it. It had won prize medals at international exhibitions. Its directors sat on charitable boards. Its name was, in the language of the period, a respectable one. And the building itself was meant to say so before a single match had been struck. Walk through the gates, though, which Nell did most mornings, among a crowd of several hundred other girls and women converging from every direction at once, boots on cobbles, shawls pulled close even in summer against the early chill, and the character of the place changed within a few dozen steps. The yard itself smelled faintly of sulphur even before the working day began, a residue that never fully left the brickwork or the air above it, seeping outward from whichever building held the dipping room on any given hour of production. Workers were sorted by department almost the instant they crossed the threshold, funneled toward one building for the making of the wooden splints, another for the dipping that turned plain wood into a working match, another still for the boxing and packing that prepared the finished product for sale. Nell's own route each morning took her past the box-making sheds, where younger girls, some of them barely past the age of 12, despite official rules that were supposed to keep children that age out of full-time factory labor, sat folding and gluing the small paper and wood containers that would eventually hold 100 matches apiece. And on into the low, long dipping room where she herself worked, a building that from the outside looked no different from any of the others, and that inside told a very different story indeed. The scale of the operation is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy, hearing the word factory, to imagine something smaller and more personal than what Fairfield Works actually was. This was not a workshop. It was closer to a small industrial town unto itself, moving raw timber in one end and finished box matches out the other in quantities numbering in the millions of sticks a week, supplying not only Britain's own domestic demand, but a substantial export trade as well. Historians who have studied the company's own surviving records, among them Louise Raw, whose research into the Bryant and May match women remains the fullest modern account of exactly who these workers were and how their factory actually functioned day to day, have traced how thoroughly the firm's public reputation for order, modern efficiency, depended on labor that was at ground level, neither well paid nor particularly well protected. Performed almost entirely by working-class girls and young women whose names appear in the company's own wage ledgers far more often than they appear anywhere else in the historical record. That imbalance in the record itself, ledgers full of names attached to nothing but a weekly wage figure, diary entries and newspaper columns almost entirely silent on who those names actually belong to, is part of why a composite figure like Nell is necessary to tell this story honestly at all. The individual match girls at Bow left behind their wages, their fines, and occasionally their testimony to a reporter or a select committee. They rarely left behind anything resembling the kind of full, personal record that would let history remember any single one of them the way it remembers Wilberforce Bryant or Annie Besant. For Nell, the geography of an ordinary day settled into a rhythm within her first weeks at the factory and never much varied after that. 6 o'clock at the gate. A march across the yard with the sulphur smell already faint in the air, into the dipping room where the real work of her day would begin, and where, unlike the girls in the boxing sheds who could at least talk quietly over their folding and gluing, silence was expected and largely enforced, because the task in front of her required a steadiness of hand that idle chatter tended to disturb. She would not leave that room again, except for the 2 short meal breaks the day allowed, until the bell rang somewhere close to 6 in the evening. A working day of roughly 12 hours on the factory floor itself, bracketed on either end by the walk there and back, so that the portion of her day claimed by Bryant and May, gate to gate, ran close to 14 hours in total, 6 days out of every 7, week after week, for a wage we will look at closely in the chapter ahead. There is something worth noticing before we go any further into what actually happened inside that building, in the plain fact that a factory capable of winning exhibition medals and paying its shareholders handsomely could also be a place where a 14-year-old girl spent 14 hours of her day, 6 days of her week, in a room where talking was not permitted and the air itself was never entirely clean. The respectability on Fairfield Road's frontage and the reality inside its dipping room were not 2 separate stories. They were the same story, viewed from 2 different distances, and Nell walked between those distances every single morning without ever once being asked which version was true. Money, then. Because money was where the arithmetic of the whole system became impossible to hide. And it is where most people's assumptions about a Victorian factory girl's life tend to be the most generous and the most wrong. If you picture a match girl's wage packet at all, you probably picture something small but at least straightforward. A modest sum handed over honestly at the end of the week for honest work performed. What the kind of thin but dependable income that let a working-class family scrape by without much room for comfort, but without any particular trickery involved either. That picture, gentle as it is, does not survive contact with the wage book Bryant and May actually kept. A match girl at Fairfield Works in 1888 could expect to earn, depending on her department, and her age, somewhere between 4 and 8 shillings for a full week's labor, roughly 12 hours a day. Girls in the boxing departments, paid by the piece for every gross of matchboxes filled and folded, sat toward the lower end of that range. Women in the dipping room, where the work demanded more skill and carried more physical risk, could occasionally clear a little more. Set against the cost of even the most basic subsistence in East London, rent for 2 rooms, coal, bread, the occasional piece of meat, a wage in that range left a family like Nell's with almost no margin whatsoever, and it left an unmarried worker supporting herself alone. Very few weeks did. What made the wage book especially punishing was not simply its low ceiling, but the elaborate and specific system of deductions the company applied beneath it. A system of fines that the journalist and reformer Annie Besant would later document in exacting detail, and that a subsequent Parliamentary Select Committee investigating sweated labour would hear described directly from the mouths of the workers themselves. A girl could be fined for talking during working hours, a shilling in some recorded instances, a full quarter or more of an entire week's wages, lost to a single sentence exchanged with the girl at the next bench. She could be fined for dropping matches on the floor, for having an untidy bench, for arriving even a few minutes late, for having feet the foreman judged insufficiently clean, a standard he alone defined and enforced at his own discretion. She could be fined for a burnt or spoiled matchbox even when the fault lay with faulty material rather than her own hand, since the finished goods leaving the factory reflected on the firm's name and somebody had to bear the cost of any imperfection, and that somebody was never the company. Beyond the fines themselves, workers in some departments were also expected to bear small costs the company might otherwise have absorbed as an ordinary part of running its own operation, contributing toward brushes and other minor equipment used in their work. Practice common enough across sweated trades of the period that reformers investigating the broader phenomenon of sweated labor gave it its own informal name, the truck system, describing any arrangement in which an employer recovered part of a worker's wage through required purchases, deductions. Poi alla charges rather than paying that wage out cleanly and in full. None of these individual costs, examined in isolation, looked especially dramatic on paper. Added together across a full week against a wage already sitting at 4 to 8 shillings, they meaningfully narrowed the thin margin a family like Nell's depended on to get from one payday to the next. Historians, examining the surviving testimony from this period, Louise Raw, prominent among them in her research into the matchwomen specifically, have noted how these fines functioned less as genuine quality control and more as a second informal wage system running underneath the official one. A mechanism that let the factory quietly claw back a portion of what it had just paid out, week after week, with almost no oversight beyond the individual foreman's own judgment about who deserved to keep their full pay. Workers had essentially no means of disputing a fine once it was levied. There was no appeal, no independent inspector standing between a foreman's word and a girl's wage packet, and the threat sitting behind every fine was not merely a smaller payday, but the far more serious possibility of dismissal. A threat that carried enormous weight in a district where hundreds of other girls stood ready to take any vacated position by the following morning. For Nell, the arithmetic of the fines had become, within her first year at Fairfield Works, a kind of second attention she carried alongside the physical work itself. A constant low-grade vigilance about her feet, her bench, her hands, the precise angle at which she set down a finished box. She had been fined twice in her time there, once for talking a whispered word to the girl beside her about whether the rain outside had let up, and once for a scorched box she was fairly certain had come to her already imperfect from an earlier stage of the line. Both times the shilling came directly out of wages. Her mother was already counting before Nell had even walked through the door that evening. And both times, Nell said nothing about it at home, absorbing the loss quietly, the way she had learned to absorb most things, because there was no version of the conversation. Only a version that ended with her mother worrying about something neither of them could change. The broader picture that emerges from the wage records and the testimony collected around them is one in which the published weekly rate, modest as it already was, represented not a guarantee, but a ceiling that very few workers actually reached in full, week after week, once the fines had done their work. Bryant and May was, by the standards of its own era, a highly profitable concern, its dividends to shareholders running well above what most manufacturing firms of the period managed to return, and the gap between net profitability and the wages paid to the women and girls actually producing it was not an oversight born of thin margins. It was a choice, defended at the time, when it was defended at all, on the grounds that female and juvenile labor was simply worth less in the market than a grown man's, a piece of economic reasoning that conveniently ignored the fact that the entire dipping room, the department carrying the gravest physical risk in the whole operation, was staffed almost exclusively by women and girls, precisely because their labor could be purchased so cheaply. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that a shilling taken for a whispered sentence about the weather represented, for a girl like Nell, a quarter of what her family had to spend on food for the coming week. The fine was never really about the talking. It was about how much of a person's dignity a factory could extract before that person had any language left to object with. Now, the work itself, because everything the wage book took away in fines was earned in the first place, in a room that most people picturing a Victorian match factory have never actually pictured accurately at all. If you imagine the making of a match, you probably imagine something closer to a modern factory line, machines doing the dangerous chemical work, while human hands stay safely at a distance, guiding wood and paper, rather than touching anything truly hazardous. The dipping room at Fairfield Works, the department where Nell spent the great majority of her working life, offered nothing like that distance. It offered instead one of the most direct and sustained forms of chemical exposure that any Victorian industry asked of its workers, applied by hand for hours at a stretch to girls who had received essentially no warning about what the substance in front of them was actually capable of doing. The process itself, mechanically speaking, was not especially complicated. Thin wooden splints, cut and dried in an earlier stage of production, were bundled into wooden frames holding several hundred sticks at a time, arranged upright with their tips protruding in even rows. These frames were then carried to long, shallow pans kept warm over a low heat, pans filled with a thick, pale paste that was the true heart of the entire industry, a mixture combining white phosphorus with glue, a binding agent, and typically a small quantity of an oxidizing compound such as potassium chlorate, blended into a substance that would ignite instantly and reliably the moment it met friction. A dipper, almost always a young woman or older girl by 1888, would press the frame of splint tips down into the pan in a single, controlled motion, coating each tip evenly, then lift and set the frame aside to dry before the coated matches were removed, sorted, and passed along toward the boxing sheds. White phosphorus itself, the substance, the center of this entire operation, is worth understanding plainly, without exaggeration, because the plain facts alone carry more than enough weight. It is a waxy, pale yellow solid, so chemically unstable in the presence of ordinary air that it must be stored underwater to prevent it from spontaneously combusting. And it emits, even at room temperature, a faint vapor with the distinct, sharp smell of garlic mixed with something more acrid beneath it, a smell that soaked into the walls. The wooden benches, the clothing, and the hair of everyone who worked near it for any length of time. The dipping room where Nell and perhaps 30 other girls worked at any given hour was, by design and by economic necessity, rather than by any deliberate cruelty on the part of the individual foreman overseeing it, poorly ventilated, its windows small and often kept shut against drafts that might disturb the drying frames, so that the vapor released by pan after pan of heated phosphorus paste simply accumulated in the air across the length of a working day, thickening toward evening the way smoke thickens in an unaired room. The physical evidence of this exposure showed itself first and most visibly on the hands. Phosphorus paste stained skin, a persistent, unmistakable yellow that no amount of scrubbing fully removed, a color every dipper in the building carried on her fingers and wrists as a kind of unwanted uniform, visible from across a room and instantly recognizable to anyone in the East End who knew what that particular shade meant. Nell's own hands had carried that stain since her second week on the job, and she had stopped, by this point, trying to scrub it away before Sunday chapel, since the effort accomplished almost nothing beyond raw knuckles. For Nell, a typical stretch at the dipping pan settled into a physical rhythm she performed without much conscious thought after her first months of practice. Lift the frame, press it down into the warm paste, hold it level for the count of a breath, lift again. The smell, sharp and faintly sweet and underlaid with something acrid that never fully left the back of her throat, had become so constant a presence in her working hours that she noticed it now mainly by its brief absence on the walk home each evening, when the East End air, itself hardly clean, nonetheless struck her lungs as a kind of relief simply for lacking that particular note in it. She did not yet fully understand, in the way the chapters ahead of this account will explain in full, exactly what accumulating inside her own jaw and gums, with every breath taken over that pan, actually meant. Very few of the girls working beside her did either, not because the danger was unknown to medicine, but because almost nobody with the power to warn them had troubled themselves to do so. The chemical hazard was in some ways only half of what the dipping room asked of a worker's body. The other half was simpler to describe and easier to overlook precisely because it had nothing exotic about it. The plain accumulating strain of standing at a single station for the better part of 12 hours, repeating the same small motion several thousand times before the closing bell. Dippers were not permitted stools at their stations, since sitting was considered incompatible with the controlled, level pressure the pan required, and by the middle of an ordinary afternoon, Nell's feet and lower back carried an ache distinct from anything connected to phosphorus at all, the ordinary unglamorous toll of a body asked to hold one position, performing one motion for longer than anybody reasonably ought to be asked to do. Her wrists, too, had developed a particular stiffness by her second year in the trade, most noticeable on the coldest mornings, when the first hour of work each day carried a dull soreness that only eased once her hands had properly warmed to the pace of the frames. None of this appeared in any inspector's report or any wage negotiation. It was simply what the job did to a growing girl's body, quietly and continuously, alongside the more dramatic danger this account is about to describe in full. The broader context here matters, and it is worth stating plainly rather than leaving implied. The medical dangers of white phosphorus exposure had been documented in European medical literature since at least the 1,830 seconds first identified among matchworkers in Vienna and subsequently confirmed by physicians across Germany, France, and Britain over the following decades. This was not, by 1888, a mysterious or newly discovered hazard. Safer alternatives existed and had existed for years. Most significantly, the red phosphorus process developed in Sweden decades earlier, which produced matches that struck only against a specially prepared surface rather than any rough surface at all. and which carried none of the vapor risk that made white phosphorus so dangerous to the workers handling it daily. Swedish and other continental manufacturers had already adopted these safer methods at scale. British firms, Bryant and May chief among them, given its size and market dominance, continued producing white phosphorus matches well past the point where ignorance could serve as any kind of excuse, because the white phosphorus process remained cheaper, and because the workers absorbing its cost. In the economic calculation, the company applied, without ever stating it aloud, considered an acceptable price for that cheapness. There is something worth holding on to in the fact that the danger sitting in the pans Nell dipped her frames into every working day was neither hidden from science nor unavoidable by any real technical constraint. It had a name, a known cause, and a known alternative, all three understood decades before Nell was born. What it lacked was a factory owner willing to spend the money the alternative required, and a legal system willing to make that spending compulsory before the harm had already been done to thousands of girls exactly like her. Which brings us to the question that seems almost too obvious to need asking, and yet carries one of the darkest details in this entire account once it is actually answered. Where did the girls in the dipping room eat their meals? If you picture a factory worker's lunch break at all, you probably picture something modest, but at least sensibly arranged. A separate room, however plain, where a worker could set down her tools, wash her hands, and eat away from whatever machinery or material occupied her working hours. Fairfield Works, for the great majority of its operating history through 1888, offered no such room to the women and girls of the dipping department. Meals were taken at the bench in the same air that had been thickening with phosphorus vapor since 6 that morning, surrounded by the same pans, the same drying frames, the same fine yellow dust that settled invisibly and continuously onto every exposed surface in the room. The reason for this arrangement was in the company's own accounting, a simple matter of efficiency. A separate dining room meant lost floor space and lost working minutes spent walking between departments, expenses the firm saw little reason to absorb when the existing arrangement cost nothing extra and had never been legally required to change. Workers were permitted 2 short breaks in the course of a 14-hour day, one at midday and one somewhat shorter break in the afternoon. And during both of them, they remained exactly where they had been standing or sitting all morning, unwrapping whatever bread or cold meat they had carried from home and eating it with hands that had spent the preceding hours pressing wooden frames into phosphorus paste. The medical consequence of this arrangement was as direct as it was entirely preventable. Phosphorus dust and residue, present on the hands, the benches, and quite literally suspended in the air of the room, transferred onto food with every bite a worker took, and swallowed phosphorus, even in the small quantities a hurried lunch might carry, is absorbed by the body and travels with a particular and terrible affinity for exactly the tissue that would eventually suffer most. Physicians investigating occupational phosphorus poisoning across the second half of the 19th century identified contaminated food as one of the clearest and most avoidable pathways of exposure in the entire industry, a hazard that a single dedicated eating room, properly separated from the working floor and equipped with the means to wash before a meal, could have substantially reduced. Bryant and May did not provide one, not out of any special hostility toward its workers, but out of the same plain economic logic that governed nearly every other decision the wage book and the fine system had already revealed. A canteen cost money. The workers eating phosphorus dust with their bread cost the company nothing at all. At least, not in any column of the ledger anyone at Fairfield Works was troubling to keep. For Nell, the midday break had become, over her year in the dipping room, less a period of rest than a brief pause within the same continuous environment she had occupied since 6 that morning. She sat, as she always did, on an overturned crate near her own station, unwrapped the bread and dripping her mother had packed for her before dawn, and ate it in the company of 2 other girls from her row. Their conversation kept low and brief, since the foreman's tolerance for talk did not entirely disappear. She had noticed, without ever quite articulating the thought to herself, that her bread sometimes carried a faint bitterness at the crust, a taste she associated, when she thought about it at all, with the general smell of the room rather than with anything specifically wrong with the food itself. She had no reason to imagine that the taste and the smell were, in the plainest possible sense, the same substance, entering her body twice over, in the course of a single working day. Once through the air she breathed, and once through the food she had just eaten with unwashed hands. The broader picture here connects directly back to the wage and fine system already described, because workers who might otherwise have insisted on a proper breakaway from their materials, or refused to eat contaminated food, were operating inside a system that offered them no meaningful leverage to make that demand. A girl who left her station for longer than the permitted break risked a fine or worse. A girl who complained too loudly about conditions risked her position entirely, in a district where a queue of other girls stood ready to take it. The economic desperation this account has already traced through the wage book did not simply lower what these workers were paid. It actively prevented them from protecting their own bodies from hazard that both science and simple common sense could have addressed decades earlier, had anyone with the power to change it been sufficiently motivated to do so. It is worth noting, since the point will matter again later in this account, that the eventual provision of a proper eating room, separate from the dipping benches, was among the very first concessions the workers themselves demanded once they finally found the collective voice to demand anything at all. They understood, without needing a physician's report to explain it to them, that the bread eaten at the bench was doing them a particular kind of harm, even if the precise chemistry of how phosphorus traveled from a pan to a mouthful of dripping remained, for most of them, a matter of instinct rather than formal medical knowledge. That instinct, it would turn out, was exactly right. There is something quietly devastating in the fact that the very meal meant to sustain a 14-year-old girl through the second half of her working day was in that particular room one more delivery mechanism for the poison already filling her lungs. The bread was not the danger. The room it was eaten in was, and nobody with the authority to move that meal somewhere safer had bothered to ask why it hadn't already been done. The first signs, when they came, rarely announced themselves as anything more than an ordinary toothache. And this is where the story turns from the merely difficult toward the truly frightening, though it does so quietly at first, the way most serious illness in this account actually began. If you imagine the onset of phosphorus poisoning inside the body, you might picture something dramatic and immediate, a sudden and unmistakable collapse that would have sent any sensible worker straight to a doctor the moment it appeared. The actual progression of what the era's physicians called phosphorus necrosis, and what the workers themselves called by its plainer and more frightening name, phossy jaw, unfolded far more slowly and far more ambiguously than that, beginning with symptoms so ordinary and so easily explained away that a great many affected workers, Nell eventually, among them, continued at their benches for weeks or months before the truth of what was happening became impossible to deny. The earliest sign was almost always a toothache, persistent and dull, rather than sharp, often centered around a tooth that had recently been extracted or had a cavity or minor gum injury already present, since broken or compromised tissue in the mouth gave the absorbed phosphorus. This was followed, in the cases that progressed, by swelling along the gum line, a tenderness that made chewing uncomfortable, and eventually a low-grade fever and a general sense of being unwell that a worker in Nell's position, already accustomed to fatigue and minor illness as a permanent background condition of her life, had every reason to dismiss as nothing more than a passing cold or a bad tooth needing pulling. The economic pressure bearing down on any worker noticing these symptoms cannot be overstated, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than left as background context. A girl who reported a persistent toothache to the factory's medical attendant, where one existed at all, risked an examination that might reveal the true cause and result in her dismissal, since a worker with visible phosphorus necrosis was, from the company's perspective, a liability rather than an asset. Evidence of exactly the harm the firm preferred not to have documented in its own records. A girl who said nothing and continued working risked the disease progressing further, but she kept her wage, and for a family depending on that wage the way Nell's family depended on hers, the calculation, grim as it was rarely a difficult one to make. Silence, for as long as silence remained physically possible, was very often the only rational choice available to a worker in her position, and this single fact, more than any other in the entire history of Fossey Jaw, explains why so many cases went unreported and untreated until they had progressed far beyond any hope of simple correction. For Nell, the toothache arrived in the late summer of that year, a dull ache on the lower left side that she noticed first while chewing a heel of bread during her midday break, and that she attributed, for the better part of 2 weeks, to a cavity she had been meaning to have looked at since the previous spring. She said nothing about it to her mother, partly from the same instinct toward quiet endurance that had kept her silent about the fines, and partly from a fear she had not yet allowed herself to name directly, a fear that had begun circulating among the girls in her row in the low, careful whispers reserved for the subject. Nobody wanted to be the one to raise first. 2 other dippers on her own bench had left the factory within the past year, for reasons nobody discussed openly. And Nell had noticed, without wanting to notice, the particular swelling along one of their jaws in the weeks before she stopped seeing her at all. The girls who remained rarely spoke of it directly, even among themselves, preferring instead a kind of coded, sideways vocabulary that let them acknowledge the danger without naming it plainly enough to feel it fully. A girl who left the dipping room for a hospital examination and did not return was said among the others to have gone to see about her teeth. A phrase carrying a weight far beyond its ordinary domestic sound, understood instantly by every girl on the bench and never once explained to anyone outside it. The broader context surrounding this early stage of the illness reveals something important about how thoroughly economic desperation shaped the medical reality of an entire industry. Physicians examining occupational disease in match manufacturing districts across Britain and continental Europe throughout the second half of the century repeatedly noted this same pattern: workers concealing early symptoms for as long as physically possible, not from ignorance of what those symptoms might mean. Calculation about which risk, the disease or the loss of wages, posed the more immediate threat to survival. The disease itself did not discriminate by a worker's intelligence or care. It discriminated by nothing more complicated than proximity to the pans, hour after hour, week after week, and the length of time a worker managed to hide its earliest signs from a foreman who had every institutional reason not to look too closely in the first place. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the earliest and most survivable stage of this disease was also the stage a worker was most likely to hide, out of a fear entirely reasonable given the world she lived in. The silence that let Fossey Jaw progress from a manageable toothache into the disfiguring horror that chapters ahead will describe was not a failure of the workers themselves. It was the predictable, almost mathematical result of a system that made honesty about one's own body more dangerous than the disease it might have caught in time. There is a detail in this next part of the story that sounds, on first hearing, like something invented for effect, a piece of Gothic embellishment, added later by writers wanting a more dramatic tale to tell. It is not invented. It is documented plainly in the medical literature of the period, and it deserves to be stated clearly and without hedging before we go any further. In the advanced stages of this disease, the affected bone of a worker's jaw could genuinely glow faintly in the dark. This is not a metaphor. It is a direct physical consequence of the same chemical property that makes phosphorus useful for lighting a match in the first place. And understanding why it happens tells you almost everything you need to know. If you imagine phosphorus necrosis as simply a bad infection, painful but conceptually similar to any other serious dental problem left untreated, you are picturing something considerably gentler than what the disease actually did to the body. White phosphorus, once absorbed into the bloodstream through the lungs, through broken skin, or through contaminated food, exactly as described in the previous chapter, has a particular chemical affinity for bone tissue, accumulating there over months of repeated low-level exposure in a way that most other absorbed substances do not. The jawbone in particular, because of its direct proximity to the mouth, gums, where phosphorus vapor and dust made their most immediate and sustained contact, tended to accumulate the highest concentrations of any bone in the body. And it was there, almost exclusively, that the disease did its most visible and devastating work. The process itself, once it moved past the early toothache and swelling this account has already described, followed grim and fairly consistent progression. The accumulated phosphorus began to poison the living bone tissue of the jaw directly, cutting off its blood supply and causing the bone to die in place while still situated inside a living, breathing person, a condition physicians of the period termed necrosis, drawing on the same Greek root that gives us the word for death itself. As the dead bone tissue began to separate from the healthy bone around it, the jaw swelled dramatically, sometimes disfiguring a worker's face almost beyond recognition within a period of weeks. Abscesses formed and drained, producing a persistent, foul-smelling discharge that no amount of ordinary hygiene could fully control, since the source of the infection lay inside the bone itself, rather than on any surface a worker could simply wash. Teeth loosened and fell out as the bone supporting them died beneath them. And in a portion of documented cases, severe enough and progressed far enough, the dead bone tissue did indeed exhibit a faint phosphorescent glow, visible in complete darkness, the same chemical property responsible for the element's very name, drawn from the Greek word for light-bearing. Now, displaying itself inside the mouth of a teenage girl, rather than on the tip of a struck match. Medical writers of the period, working without the benefit of modern biochemistry to fully explain the mechanism, nonetheless documented the visible symptoms with a thoroughness that survives in the medical journals and hospital case records of Britain and continental Europe across several decades. The condition had first been clearly identified among matchworkers in Vienna, in the 1830 seconds, described in German and Austrian medical literature, well before British physicians began publishing their own case studies from London's East End and from match manufacturing towns elsewhere in the country. By the time Nell entered the trade in the late 1880 seconds, phossy jaw was not a mystery to medicine. It was a known, named, and well-characterized occupational disease, its cause understood, its progression documented, its connection to white phosphorus exposure established beyond any serious scientific doubt among physicians who bothered to study it. What made the disease especially cruel, beyond its physical horror, was the response it frequently received from the very medical authorities positioned to recognize and address it honestly. Factory doctors, where a firm employed one at all, and general practitioners treating affected workers in their own private practice, quite often attributed the condition, publicly and sometimes even in official correspondence, Diagnosis that conveniently shifted responsibility away from the employer and the substance he required his workers to handle, and onto the personal habits of a teenage girl earning a few shillings a week. This was not universal. Some physicians, particularly those publishing in the more serious medical journals of the period, stated plainly that occupational phosphorus exposure was the clear and primary cause. But the poor hygiene explanation circulated widely enough and served the interests of factory owners conveniently enough that it shaped public perception of the disease for decades, allowing a great many people outside the trade to regard phossy jaw as an unfortunate consequence of working-class carelessness rather than what it actually was. A direct and entirely foreseeable result of a chemical process the employer had chosen. For reasons of cost, not to replace with a safer alternative that already existed. For Nell, the toothache that had troubled her since late summer had, by the time the year turned toward autumn, become something considerably more frightening than a bad tooth needing pulling. The swelling along her jaw had grown pronounced enough that she had taken to keeping her face turned slightly away from her mother at supper, and the ache had settled into a constant low presence that no longer fully receded even during the brief hours she spent away from the factory. She had not yet told anyone, not her mother, not the two girls she ate lunch beside, not even, fully and honestly, herself, though she had begun, on the nights when sleep came slowly, to press her fingers gently against the swollen place and wonder, in the careful, sideways manner a person allows themselves to wonder about something they are not yet ready to face directly. Whether the whispered stories she had heard about the girls who left the factory and never came back. She had not yet checked, in the full dark of her shared room, whether anything about her own jaw looked different from how it ought to look. She would within a matter of weeks. And when she finally did, alone, in the hour before dawn on an ordinary working morning, what she found would end, for good, any remaining possibility of continuing to tell herself that this was only a bad tooth. The broader context surrounding phossy jaw spread through Britain's match industry reveals just how avoidable the entire epidemic actually was, a word that is not an exaggeration given how many workers across the industry, not merely at Bryant and May, but across the whole of British match manufacturing, contracted some degree of phosphorus necrosis over the course of the disease's several decades of documented prevalence. Continental manufacturers using red phosphorus processes reported the condition only rarely and almost exclusively among workers exposed to white phosphorus through other channels entirely. The disease was, in the most direct sense available to historical analysis, a manufactured hazard rather than an inevitable one, a cost that fell entirely on the bodies of young working-class women, while the industry that created the conditions for it continued throughout this same period. To report healthy profits and pay comfortable dividends to shareholders who never once had reason to picture what a glowing jawbone actually looked like in the dark. There is something worth holding onto in the fact that the disease, this well documented, this clearly understood by the medical science of its own era, could nonetheless be blamed, publicly and repeatedly, on the personal failings of the very girls suffering from it. The glow in the dark was real. The excuse offered to explain it away was not. Once a case of phossy jaw had progressed to the point where the dead bone could no longer be ignored, Victorian medicine offered exactly one meaningful intervention, and understanding what that intervention actually involved tells you a great deal about the particular horror of being sick in this specific way, in this specific decade. With no better options available anywhere in the world. If you imagine Victorian surgery for a serious jaw infection, you might picture something roughly comparable in its broad shape to a difficult but survivable modern dental procedure unpleasant and painful by any standard but conceptually familiar, a course of treatment aimed at saving as much of the natural structure as medically possible. The actual treatment available to a phossy jaw patient in 1888 bore almost no resemblance to that gentler picture. Once necrosis had progressed beyond its earliest stage, the only intervention capable of stopping the infection spread and preventing the sepsis that would otherwise, in a meaningful number of documented cases, prove fatal, was surgical removal of the affected portion of the jawbone itself. Performed by whatever methods anesthesia and antiseptic practice could offer at the time. Methods that by modern standards remained crude, uncertain, and themselves dangerous in their own right. Ether and chloroform anesthesia had, by 1888, become reasonably standard for major surgical procedures in Britain's better hospitals, a real and meaningful mercy compared to the entirely conscious surgery of earlier decades, and a patient undergoing a mandibulectomy, the surgical term for removal of part or all of the lower jawbone, could generally expect to be unconscious for the procedure itself. What awaited her on waking was considerably harder to soften. The surgery left patients disfigured in a manner that could not be concealed or corrected by any means available at the time. The lower portion of the face altered permanently, sometimes dramatically, depending on how much bone the infection had already claimed before the surgeon reached her. Reconstructive techniques capable of restoring anything resembling a normal facial appearance simply did not exist yet in any meaningful form. Antibiotics, the medicine that would eventually make this kind of surgery vastly safer by controlling the very infections that made it necessary in the first place, remained more than 4 decades in the future, meaning that every patient undergoing this procedure faced a genuine risk of dying, not from the disease itself, but from the surgical intervention meant to save her, through infection, through blood loss, through the general uncertainty that attended any major operation performed under the medical conditions of the era. A worker from Bow requiring this surgery would most often have been carried by cart or on foot, depending on how far the disease had already progressed, to the London Hospital in Whitechapel, the great voluntary hospital that served the East End's enormous working-class population. Had accumulated considerable direct experience treating cases of occupational phosphorus necrosis among match workers from Fairfield Works and from the smaller manufacturers. The hospital surgeons were, by this point in the century, familiar enough with the disease's particular pattern of destruction that the procedure itself, however dangerous, had become something closer to a recognized, if grim, specialty, rather than a novel and improvised response to an unfamiliar condition. That familiarity offered a genuine, if modest, comfort to a frightened patient. It did nothing to change the fundamental facts of the surgery itself, the disfigurement it left behind, or the absence of anything resembling modern infection control to guard against the complications that still claimed a meaningful share of the patients who underwent it. For a worker who survived the surgery, the aftermath carried its own particular cruelty, one that extended well beyond the physical recovery itself. A visibly disfigured face closed off most of the limited employment options already available to a working-class woman in East London, since domestic service, shop work, and a great many factory positions all depended, to one degree or another, on a presentable appearance that phossy jaw surgery permanently. A young woman who had entered the trade at 13 or 14, contracted the disease, undergone the surgery, and survived, might find herself, by her late teens, essentially unemployable in the very narrow range of respectable occupations available to a woman of her class. Or increasingly desperate alternatives to survive at all. Medical journals of the period, including detailed case reports published in British medical literature through the middle and later decades of the century, documented the surgical procedure and its outcomes with a clinical thoroughness that makes for difficult reading even now, describing mortality rates from the surgery itself that varied considerably, depending on how advanced the necrosis had become before treatment, how skilled the individual surgeon, and how the patient's broader health had already been compromised by months of chronic infection. The physicians writing these accounts were not indifferent to the suffering they were documenting. Many of them argued explicitly in the same publications for the elimination of white phosphorus from match manufacturing altogether, recognizing plainly that the safest and most humane treatment for phossy jaw was never contracting it in the first place. A prevention that lay entirely within the power of factory owners and legislators to provide, and that both groups, for years, declined to act on with any real urgency. For Nell, the surgery remained, in the autumn of that year, a fear rather than a fact, a possible future glimpsed in the disappearance of the girls who had once worked beside her rather than a certainty. But the fear itself had become, by this point in her story, a constant companion at the dipping pan, present in every breath of the familiar acrid air, in every ache along her jaw that might be nothing at all or might be the beginning of everything the girls in the whispered stories had already lived through. She continued working because the alternative, a wage lost entirely, remained a danger that felt, on any given morning, considerably more immediate than a disease whose worst outcomes she had heard about only secondhand. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the only cure available to a girl like Nell was a surgery capable of saving her life while permanently narrowing every other option that life still contained. Victorian medicine had found a way to stop the disease from killing her. It had found no way at all to give her back what the disease and the industry that caused it had already taken. For a while now, this account has stayed close to the factory floor, close to Nell's own hands and her own aching jaw. It is worth stepping back for a chapter and asking a different question, one that the girls at the dipping pans rarely had the leisure to ask themselves in any detail. Who exactly was profiting from all of this, and what did their own version of 1888 actually look like? If you imagine the owners of a Victorian match factory, you might picture something close to a cartoon of industrial villainy, a mustachioed figure counting coins, while his workers suffered, fully aware of the cruelty and simply indifferent to it. The truth is both less dramatic and, in its own way, more unsettling than that image, because the men who ran Bryant and May by 1888 did not think of themselves as villains at all, and a great deal of London's respectable opinion agreed with their own assessment of themselves. The firm had been founded decades earlier by William Bryant and Frances May, both associated with the Society of Friends, the Quakers, a religious community whose public reputation in Victorian Britain rested heavily on ideas of plain dealing, temperance. By 1888, the company's chairman was Wilberforce Bryant, son of one of the founders, presiding over a firm that had grown into one of the largest and most technically advanced match manufacturers in the world. Its shares traded on the London Exchange, its name recognized in households across the country and well beyond it. The company had won medals at international exhibitions for the quality and consistency of its product. Its directors sat, as respectable Victorian businessmen of their standing generally did, on the boards of hospitals and charitable institutions, contributing to precisely the kind of civic philanthropy that built a reputation for public generosity, even as the firm's own wage book, examined closely, told a considerably less generous story about the people actually producing its wealth. The scale of that wealth is worth stating plainly, because the numbers involved make the gap between the boardroom and the dipping room difficult to explain away as simple economic necessity. Bryant and May was, through the 1,880 seconds, a highly profitable concern, paying dividends to its shareholders that ran well above what most manufacturing enterprises of the period managed to return, figures that financial commentators of the day noted approvingly as evidence of sound, well-run management. A shareholder holding stock in the firm could reasonably expect a return in the range of 20% or more in a good year, a figure that stood in stark and uncomfortable contrast to the 4 to 8 shillings a week earned by the women and girls whose labor produced that return in the first place. A contrast that Annie Besant would shortly make impossible for the London public to ignore. Wilberforce Bryant himself, the company's chairman through this period, and son of one of its founders, lived the kind of comfortable, well-appointed life that a firm of Bryant and May's standing afforded its leadership. A life spent almost entirely apart from the dipping room and the wage book, both in the way that ownership and labor, even within the same company, occupied two nearly separate worlds in Victorian Britain. There is no particular evidence that Bryant regarded himself as a harsh employer, and a fair reading of the record suggests he likely did not. He had inherited a firm built on a Quaker reputation for fair dealing. He continued the family's public philanthropy without apparent hesitation, and he would very probably have described his own conduct, if asked directly, as reasonable and moderate by the standards of his industry. That description was not entirely false. Bryant and May was not, by the admittedly grim standards of Victorian sweated labour generally, the single worst employer in London. It was, in fact, one of the more prominent and more profitable ones, which is precisely why the gap between its comfortable self-image and the documented conditions inside its own dipping room mattered so much once that gap was finally exposed to public view. One detail from this period has survived in the historical record with a particular vividness, and it is worth including here because it captures, better than any statistic could, exactly how the workers themselves experienced the distance between their own conditions. In 1884, Bryant and May commissioned and erected a statue of William Ewart Gladstone outside the Fairfield Works, honouring the statesman's earlier efforts as Chancellor of the Exchequer, some years before, to repeal a proposed tax on matches, a tax the company itself had lobbied hard against. According to accounts that have circulated widely among historians of the strike, including in Louise Raw's research into the matchwomen, the cost of the statue was understood by many of the workers to have come, at least in part, from deductions made against their own wages, whether through direct contribution or through the general tightening of an already ungenerous pay structure. Whatever the precise accounting, the resentment the statue provoked among the workforce was real and specific enough that it became, within the factory's own community, a recognized symbol of exactly the arrangement this account has already traced through the wage book and the fine system. Profit and public monument built visibly on the back of labor. The company had no intention of paying any more generously than it strictly had to. For now, the statue stood at the edge of the yard she crossed twice a day, and she had passed it hundreds of times without much conscious thought, beyond a vague, half-formed resentment she had absorbed from the older women around her. She understood, in the plain and practical way a 14-year-old understands most things about the adult economy she has been dropped into without explanation, that the statue represented money, and that money. The broader context surrounding Bryant and May's public reputation matters here because it explains why the exposure this account is about to describe landed with such force when it finally came. The firm was not an obscure or disreputable concern that London's comfortable classes had already learned to regard with suspicion. It was, by every outward measure available to a casual observer, a model of respectable British industry, Quaker-founded, internationally decorated, generously philanthropic in its public dealings. The revelation that this same respectable firm was simultaneously fining teenage girls, chilling for whispering and exposing them daily to a chemical known to rot the bone in their jaws, was not simply an addition to what the public already suspected about a disreputable trade. It was a direct contradiction of what the public had been confidently told to believe. and contradictions of that particular kind, once properly documented, tend to travel a very long way. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that a company capable of funding a public statue to a statesman could not, by its own repeated account, afford a properly ventilated dipping room or a separate space for its workers to eat their meals away from poison. The money existed. It had simply already been spent on burnishing the very reputation that the truth, once it surfaced, would spend the following weeks tearing down. The woman who tore it down, or who at minimum gave the workers themselves the platform and the language to tear it down together, arrived at Fairfield Works from a considerable distance outside the factory gates. And understanding who she was, if you imagine the person responsible for exposing conditions at Bryant and May, you might picture a labor organizer embedded within the trade itself, someone who had worked the dipping pans and understood the industry from years of direct personal experience. Annie Besant was nothing of the kind, and the fact that the exposure came from outside the factory rather than from within, it says something important about how difficult it truly was for the Matchgirls to be heard on their own terms without an outside advocate willing to lend her own considerable public platform to the task. Besant, by 1888, was already one of the most recognizable radical figures in London public life, a journalist, social reformer, and freethinker whose career had already carried her through birth control, activism, secularist campaigning. She co-edited, alongside the trade unionist Herbert Burrows, a small weekly paper called The Link, dedicated to exposing exactly the kind of social injustice that London's mainstream press tended to treat, when it addressed such subjects at all, with a discretion that left the worst details comfortably vague. In June of 1888, acting on information gathered through Burrows and through direct conversation with matchworkers themselves, Besant published an article in The Link titled "White Slavery in London," laying out in specific documented detail exactly the conditions this account has already walked through. The fines for talking and dropping matches and dirty feet, and the phosphorus necrosis that the company's own medical arrangements had done so little to prevent, or even honestly acknowledge. Besant's own part of that particular June afternoon had been an unusually restless one, even by the standards of London's small community of radical journalists and reformers. Born in 1847, he had already lived through a difficult separation from a clergyman husband, years of activity as a secularist and free-thinking lecturer at a time when such public positions carried real professional and social risk, and a widely publicized prosecution alongside the reformer Charles Bradlaugh over the publication of a pamphlet on birth control, a case that made her name known, and to a great many respectable Victorians, notorious, well before she ever turned her attention to Fairfield Works. By 1888, she had moved into the emerging socialist politics associated with the Fabian Society, and it was through that overlapping world of reformers and trade unionists, Herbert Burrows chief among them, that reports of conditions among the Bryant and May workforce first reached her in any organized, documented form. She was not, in other words, a stranger stumbling upon a cause by accident. She was a seasoned and already somewhat notorious campaigner who recognized the moment Burrows brought the matchworkers' testimony to her, exactly what kind of story she was looking at, and exactly how effectively her own considerable public platform could be turned toward exposing it. The response from Bryant and May was swift, and in a way that would prove disastrous for the company's own interests, badly misjudged. Management circulated a document among the workforce demanding that employees sign a statement denying Besant's allegations, an attempt to produce, on paper at least, a workforce publicly contradicting what most of them privately knew to be true. A significant number of workers refused to sign. Shortly afterward, a worker was dismissed, ostensibly for an unrelated infraction, but widely understood among her colleagues to be retaliation connected to the controversy the article had stirred, and it was this dismissal, more than the original article itself, that finally moved the workforce from private resentment into open collective action. Historians examining this sequence of events closely, Louise Raw's research chief among them, have pushed back against a version of this story that circulated for decades afterward and still surfaces in some popular accounts, a version crediting Besant almost entirely with organizing, as though 1,400 working-class girls and women had simply waited passively for an educated outsider to arrive and tell them what to do. The documentary record, examined carefully, tells a rather different and considerably more admirable story, one in which the workers themselves, women and girls who had already been organizing informally around, shared grievances for some time before Besant's article ever appeared, made the decision to walk out collectively. Sought Besant's help and platform once the action was already underway, rather than waiting for her instruction to begin it, and ran a great deal of the strike's own internal organization themselves through committees drawn from their own ranks. For Nell, the news of the dismissal reached the dipping room within the hour, carried bench to bench in the low, urgent murmur that the foreman's usual authority over silence proved, on this particular afternoon, entirely unable to suppress. She had read, or more accurately had heard, read aloud by an older girl who could manage the print more easily than she could herself, portions of the article that had been circulating in torn and retorn copies among the workers for several days already, and she recognized, with a jolt she had not fully anticipated, her own aching jaw and her own 2 shillings lost to fines described in language considerably plainer and more direct than anything she had ever heard used about her own life before. Something that had felt, until that week, like a private and shameful burden she alone was quietly enduring, suddenly looked, described in Besant's own uncompromising terms, like exactly what it was: an injustice. A wrong done deliberately to hundreds of girls at once by people who had every means available to stop it and had simply chosen, for years, not to. The broader significance of this moment, before we go further into what the workers actually did next, lies in that shift itself, from private shame to shared and nameable injustice. Nell had spent the better part of a year believing, in the quiet way a person believes something never actually said aloud to them, that her aching jaw and her docked wages was simply the price of her own particular bad luck, a burden she alone was expected to carry without complaint. What Besant's article gave the Matchgirls of Fairfield Works, whatever her precise role in the events that followed, was language, public and printed, and impossible to ignore, confirming that the wrong being done to Nell was being done in exactly the same form to every single girl standing beside her at every single bench in that building. That recognition, more than any single article or any single outside advocate, is what turned 1,400 individually exhausted workers into something capable of walking out through the same gate together on the same morning. What happened on the 5th of July 1888 is worth telling slowly, because it is the one part of this entire story where the girls of Fairfield Works stopped being the people things were done to and became, for a short but decisive stretch of that summer, the people making history happen on their own terms. If you imagine a Victorian labour strike, you might picture something organized well in advance, with formal notice given, meetings held, and a strike fund carefully assembled before a single worker crossed her arms and refused to pick up her tools. What actually happened at Fairfield Works that morning was considerably more spontaneous and considerably braver for exactly that reason. Word of the dismissal spread through the departments within the hour, and rather than filing individual complaints that management could dismiss or ignore one at a time, roughly 1,400 women and girls made, within that same morning, a collective decision that no single one of them could have safely made alone. They put down their work, walked out through the gates of Fairfield Works together, and did not go back in. This was, by any reasonable standard of the period, an extraordinary risk. These were workers with no savings to speak of, no union structure already in place to support them, and every reason to expect that the company could simply replace every last one of them within days from among London's enormous surplus of desperate unemployed labour. And yet they walked out anyway together, in numbers large enough that no single dismissal could plausibly answer for all of them, which was, whether the workers fully articulated it in these terms at the time or not, precisely the point. A company that could dismiss one troublesome worker with ease could not so easily dismiss 1,400 at once, not without shutting down its own production entirely, and the workers of Fairfield Works had, in the space of a single furious morning, discovered a form of leverage that individual grievance alone had never given them. Contemporary press accounts, the recollections gathered from strikers and their families in the decades afterward, describe a crowd moving west out of Bow that morning with a mood that shifted, block by block, from the nervous energy of an act nobody present had ever attempted before towards something closer to open. Girls who had spent the better part of a year speaking to one another only in the careful low murmur the dipping room permitted found themselves, for the first time in living memory, walking down a public street together in daylight, talking as loudly as they pleased, with nobody standing over them, counting the minutes or listening for an infraction to fine. Passers-by along the route, many of them entirely unaware of what had prompted the procession, stopped to watch several hundred women and girls in warm factory dress moving purposefully through streets more accustomed to seeing them only at the edges, arriving early and leaving late. Faces turned down against the weather rather than up and outward the way this particular crowd now carried itself. The strikers made their way from Bow toward Bouverie Street and Fleet Street, seeking out Besant and Burroughs at the offices connected to the link, both to inform them of what had happened, and in the more practical terms that mattered most immediately, to ask for help organizing what came next. Besant herself later described being startled by the scale and speed of what the article had set in motion, and to her considerable credit, she did not simply offer sympathetic words, "Step back." She and Burroughs helped the workers establish a strike fund, drawing on public donations that poured in once London's newspapers picked up the story, and helped organize meetings at which the strikers themselves, speaking in their own voices about their own working conditions, accessed an audience considerably wider, more influential than any factory foreman had ever allowed them. What followed was roughly 2 weeks of sustained, coordinated action, remarkable not only for its success, but for how thoroughly it was run by the workers' own elected representatives from among the strikers, women chosen by their fellow workers to negotiate directly with the company. Sympathetic as those reformers had proven themselves to be, this detail matters enormously to how the strike should actually be remembered. Newspaper coverage at the time, and a good deal of popular retelling in the decade since, tended to center Besant as the strike's author and leader, a framing that flattered a well-known public figure, while quietly erasing the agency of the women who had actually walked out of the factory, organized their own meetings, and sat across the table from company management to negotiate their own terms. Louise Raw's research has done a great deal to correct this imbalance, tracing through surviving records and later interviews with descendants of the strikers how central the matchwomen's own leadership actually was to the outcome, a correction this account means to honor rather than repeat the old, more comfortable myth. Part of why the older, simpler version of the story took hold so easily is not difficult to understand. A single well-spoken, well-connected reformer made a considerably tidier subject for newspaper coverage and later retelling than a strike committee of teenage factory girls whose names rarely made it into print at all. It was, in its own quiet way, one further instance of the same pattern this whole account has been tracing from its opening image onward, the comfortable, presentable version of a story crowding out the messier, truer one underneath it. Correcting that imbalance, giving the matchworkers themselves proper credit for their own courage and their own organizing, is not a minor historical footnote. It is close to the entire point of telling this story at all. The negotiations themselves, conducted through the second week of July, produced a result that startled a great many observers who had assumed, based on every previous attempt at labour organising among London's unskilled workforce. Bryant and May agreed to reinstate the dismissed worker, whose firing had sparked the walkout. It agreed to abolish the fine system in its entirety, the shillings docked for talking, for drop matches for dirty feet, all of it, at a stroke, removed from the wage book that had shaped so much of Nell's daily anxiety since her first months on the job. And in a change that spoke directly to one of the gravest physical dangers this account has already described in detail, the company agreed to provide a separate room where workers could eat their meals away from the phosphorus-laden air of the dipping room itself, addressing at last and only under the direct pressure of collective action, a hazard that plain common sense and available medical knowledge had made obvious for decades. In the days that followed this victory, the strikers took the further, genuinely remarkable step of formalizing their organization into a permanent body, the Union of Women Matchmakers, established in mid-July of 1888, with a membership drawn almost entirely from the Fairfield Works workforce itself. It became, virtually overnight, one of the largest trade unions of women workers anywhere in the country, at a moment when organized labor in Britain remained overwhelmingly the domain of skilled male tradesmen, men in the printing trades, the engineering shops, and similar occupations that had spent decades building formal union structures. Die in practice, if not always in explicit rule, to unskilled women and girls. The Matchgirl strike is remembered by labor historians as one of the opening events of what came to be called New Unionism, a broader wave of organizing among Britain's unskilled and semi-skilled workers that would, within a year, produce the far larger and more famous London dock strike of 1889. A wave of collective action that owed a genuine and directly traceable debt to the example the Matchgirls of Bow had set first. For Nell, the days of the strike itself passed in a blur of activity entirely unlike anything her working life had prepared her for. Meetings crowded into halls too small for the numbers attending them, her own voice hoarse from a week of talking in ways the dipping room had never permitted, joining hundreds of others in describing conditions she had, until recently, believed were simply hers alone to endure quietly. She stood, on one particular afternoon that she would describe to her own children decades later as among the proudest of her entire life, in a crowd outside the offices on Fleet Street, listening to a fellow matchworker, a girl barely older than herself, read aloud a list of the company's proposed concessions to a crowd that fell entirely silent to hear it, and then erupted, when the list was finished, into a sound she had never once heard produced by a group of working women before. An unguarded, unfined, entirely uncontrolled cheer. The broader significance of this victory, considerable as it already was in its own immediate terms, extends well beyond the specific concessions won at Fairfield Works that July. It demonstrated to a British labour movement that had largely assumed unskilled women and girls were simply too vulnerable, too replaceable, and too poorly organized to ever successfully challenge an employer of Bryant and May's size and standing, that this assumption had been wrong all along. The Matchgirls had no formal union structure to fall back on when they walked out that morning. They had no strike fund waiting in reserve, no established leadership hierarchy, none of the institutional advantages that skilled male trade unionists had spent decades building for themselves. What they had instead was numbers, solidarity forged through months and years of shared and largely silent suffering, and a willingness, once that suffering had finally been named publicly and plainly, to risk everything together rather than continue enduring it separately. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the very qualities the Matchgirls had been taught by every institution in their lives to regard as their weaknesses, their youth, their poverty, their lack of formal education or training, turned out to be no obstacle whatsoever to the kind of collective courage that actually changed their circumstances. Nell had spent a year believing herself powerless against a system that fined her a shilling for a whispered word about the rain. She walked back into that same factory, roughly 2 weeks later, as part of a workforce that had just proven to itself and to the entire country watching that it had never been as powerless as it looked from the outside. There is a temptation in telling a story that ends in a genuine and well-documented victory to let the story stop there, on the cheer outside the Fleet Street offices, on Nell's hoarse voice joining hundreds of others, on the fine system abolished and the dismissed worker reinstated. It would make for a tidier ending. It would not, however, be an honest one. And this account owes its subject considerably more honesty than that. If you assume that a strike this successful, this widely reported, this thoroughly documented as a turning point in British labour history, must have also ended the specific danger that had made Fossey Jaw a household term across working-class London, you are assuming something the actual record does not support. The Union of Women Matchmakers had won concessions covering wages, fines, and the immediate physical arrangement of the workday, genuine and meaningful victories that improved Nell's daily life, in ways she felt directly, the shilling no longer disappearing from her wage for a whispered sentence. A proper room, now available at midday, where she could eat without phosphorus dust settling onto her bread. What the strike had not won, and what no single strike by the workers alone was ever going to be capable of winning on its own, was the removal of white phosphorus itself from the manufacturing process. The pans in the dipping room continued to hold the same pale garlic-scented paste the day after the strike ended that they had held the day before it began. The chemistry that caused Fossey Jaw had not been touched by any clause in the settlement, because eliminating that chemistry entirely required either a legal prohibition the government had not yet passed, or a voluntary switch to red phosphorus that would cost the company money it had shown across the whole of this account. A consistent reluctance to spend. This gap between the strike's real achievements and its real limits deserves to be stated plainly, because it says something important at the particular kind of power available to workers in 1888 and the particular kind of power that remained for a while longer entirely out of their reach. 1,400 women and girls, organizing spontaneously and without institutional support, had proven capable of forcing a wealthy and internationally respected company to change its wage practices within the span of 2 weeks. That same workforce, determined as it was, could not by itself force an entire national industry to abandon a chemical process that remained, for the moment, perfectly legal, widely used by competitors across the country, and cheaper than any available alternative. Changing that required a different kind of pressure, entirely sustained over a much longer span of years, applied not only by workers but by physicians, by international diplomats, and eventually by legislators willing to right the prohibition. That pressure did, in fact, eventually succeed, though it took the better part of 2 more decades to do so. Decades during which Fossey Jaw continued to claim new cases across Britain's match industry, less scrutinized factories elsewhere in the country that had never experienced anything like the scrutiny Besant's article and the subsequent strike had brought down on Bryant and May specifically. Continental European governments moved first. Several countries had already restricted or banned white phosphorus in match manufacturing by the final years of the 19th century, driven by the same medical evidence that had been available and largely ignored by British industry since the 1832. The turning point on an international scale came in 1906, when representatives from a number of European nations gathered in Switzerland and signed what became known as the Berne Convention, an international agreement prohibiting the manufacture, importation. A document that finally gave reform-minded politicians in Britain the diplomatic cover and international precedent needed to push comparable legislation through Parliament at home. Britain's own prohibition followed 2 years later in 1908 with legislation that gave domestic manufacturers a transition period before the ban took full legal effect at the start of 1910. Bryant and May itself, it is worth noting, had already begun shifting a meaningful portion of its own production towards safety matches, the red phosphorus striking surface method that eliminated the vapor hazard entirely in the years following the strike and the accompanying public scrutiny that came with it. A change driven at least as much by continued public pressure and competitive necessity as by any renewed sense of moral obligation on the part of the company's directors. By the time the legal prohibition took full effect, white phosphorus matches had already become a smaller and shrinking share of the company's overall output, though the fact remains that it took a legal deadline backed by an international treaty to finish a transformation that basic medical knowledge and simple human decency had made a reasonable demand for the better part of 80 years. For a worker like Nell, now some years past the events of that particular summer, this longer and slower conclusion to the story would have arrived gradually, rather than as any single dramatic moment of relief. The immediate danger she had lived with in 1888, the specific fear of a jaw that might begin to ache and swell and eventually glow faintly in the dark, receded across the years that followed as the company's own production methods shifted, as newer workers entering the trade increasingly found themselves handling red phosphorus rather than white. And as the particular horror that had shaped her own adolescence became, for a younger generation of match workers, a story told by older women rather than a daily physical risk faced by everyone in the room. It is worth remembering, in imagining this slower resolution, that Nell herself, in this composite account, built from the documented experiences of real match workers, was fortunate enough never to develop more than the early reversible symptoms of the disease that had claimed so many of the women who worked beside her. Fortune owed partly to the earlier improvements the strike itself had won, and partly, as it was, for so many workers in her position, to simple chance. The Union of Women Matchmakers itself, the organization born in the immediate aftermath of the July walkout, continued as an active presence in the years that followed, evolving over time and eventually merging into broader general labor unions as the structure of British trade unionism itself changed across the early decades of the 20th century. Its immediate historical importance, though, extends well beyond its own institutional lifespan. Labor historians studying the emergence of new unionism, the broader movement that brought unskilled and semi-skilled workers, dockers, gas workers, and eventually workers across dozens of other trades that had previously been considered too disorganized or too replaceable to unionize successfully, into organized collective action for the first time. Consistently identify the Matchgirl strike as one of the movement's founding moments. The London dock strike of 1889, larger in scale and more widely remembered in popular accounts of British labour history, drew explicitly on the example the matchworkers had set the previous summer, its own organisers citing the Fairfield Works victory as proof that London's most vulnerable and lowest paid workers, exactly the workers the existing union movement had largely written off as impossible to organise, were, in fact, entirely capable of winning when they acted together. The broader context surrounding this longer, slower resolution reveals something worth sitting with about how meaningful change actually tends to arrive in situations like this one. It rarely arrives all at once in a single decisive victory that resolves every dimension of the original injustice simultaneously. Matchgirl's strike changed immediately and completely the wages, the fines, and the immediate physical conditions surrounding meals, genuine and significant improvement that mattered enormously to every worker living through them day to day. Took an additional 20 years, a shift in international diplomacy, and continued advocacy from physicians and reformers who kept the issue of phosphorus necrosis in front of the public long after the initial newspaper coverage of the strike had faded. Before the underlying chemical hazard that had caused so much of the original suffering was finally removed from British industry altogether. Both timelines are true. Both deserve to be told, because a version of this story that stops at the cheer on Fleet Street, satisfying as that ending feels, leaves out the 20 years of continued risk that a great many workers in factories that never received Busan's attention or anything like it continued to live through in the meantime. There is something worth holding on to in the fact that the Matchgirls did not need to win everything at once in order for what they won to matter. Nell's shilling, no longer taken from her for a whispered word about the weather, was a real and immediate improvement to a 14-year-old girl's actual life, whatever remained unfinished in the wider industry around her. The fuller victory, the one that finally emptied the pans of white phosphorus altogether, belonged to a longer struggle that outlasted the particular summer this account has spent so much time inside, carried forward by people who had learned from watching 1,400 matchworkers walk out through a factory gate together exactly what collective refusal was capable of accomplishing when it was sustained for long enough. Before we step back from Fairfield Works entirely, it is worth widening the lens for a moment, because Nell's story, composite as it is, risks leaving the impression that the Matchgirl's experience belonged to a single building on a single street in Bow, an isolated case rather than a pattern repeated, with only minor variation, across an entire industry, and in truth, across a great deal of the wider economy surrounding it. If you picture the Matchgirl story as unique to Bryant and May, specifically singled out by particularly cruel management at one especially notable factory, you would be missing how ordinary this arrangement actually was across British manufacturing in this period. Bryant and May was not the only match producer using white phosphorus in 1888, merely the largest, and thanks to Besant's article and the strike that followed, by far the most publicly documented. Smaller matchworks operated in Glasgow, in Gloucester, in Liverpool and elsewhere across the country, each employing its own workforce of young women and girls under conditions that varied in specific severity, but shared the same basic chemistry, the same essential wage structure, and the same fundamental willingness to treat occupational disease as an acceptable cost of doing business, rather than a hazard demanding immediate correction. The workers at these smaller, less scrutinized factories rarely received the kind of public attention Fairfield Works did in the summer of 1888. And it is worth remembering, in imagining their lives, that a company escaping public scrutiny, it is simply a company whose workers suffered the same conditions without the same chance of being heard. Bryant and May itself operated beyond Bow as well, maintaining production at other sites, including a substantial works in Glasgow, where a separate workforce of Scottish women and girls handled the same chemistry under broadly similar arrangements. Largely outside the direct glare that Besant's article and the London press had focused so intensely on Fairfield Road. The Glasgow workers would eventually organise their own actions in later years, part of a slower, wider pattern of labour unrest that rippled outward from the original 1888 victory across the company's various sites, though none of these later actions received quite the same degree of national attention. In part because London's press and London's reformers, Besant among them, were simply closer at hand to notice it happening. The Matchgirl's situation also fit within a considerably larger pattern of what contemporaries called sweated labour, a term covering a broad range of trades, tailoring, bootmaking, furniture assembly, and dozens of others, in which low-paid, largely female and immigrant workforces produced goods for wages that fell well below what even a minimally adequate standard of living required. A parliamentary select committee investigating this broader phenomenon convened in the very same year as the Matchgirl strike, gathered testimony from workers across many of these trades, describing conditions that echoed, in their essential shape, exactly what Besant had documented at Fairfield Works: long hours, arbitrary deductions, and physical environments that treated worker health as entirely subordinate to production cost. The Matchgirls were not an aberration within Victorian industry. They were, in a very real sense, representative of it, distinguished mainly by the particular vividness and horror of phossy jaw as a documented physical consequence, and by the unusual, hard-won fact that their own collective action actually succeeded in forcing change. It is also worth remembering, in stepping back this far, how young the workforce genuinely was across this entire industry, not merely at Bryant and May, but throughout British match manufacturing generally. Official regulation under the Factory and Workshop Acts of this period set certain minimum ages and maximum hours for younger workers, provisions that existed on paper and were, in practice, unevenly enforced across an industry desperate for cheap and compliant labor. Girls younger than the legal minimum working age not infrequently found their way onto factory floors through informal arrangements, borrowed papers, sympathetic foremen, or simple economic desperation on the part of families who needed every possible wage a household could produce. Now, at 14, sat comfortably within the range of ages documented among the real matchworkers whose testimony survives from this period, but she was by no means the youngest girl standing at a dipping pan in the summer of 1888, a detail that ought to unsettle rather than merely inform. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes from widening the lens this far, and it is not a comfortable one. The specific horror of phossy jaw, vivid and documentable as it is, can obscure just how unremarkable its underlying causes actually were within the broader economy of Victorian Britain. Low wages, arbitrary discipline, hazardous working conditions, accepted as the ordinary cost of cheap production. All of this extended far beyond match manufacturing into trades touching nearly every corner of what a comfortable Victorian household actually consumed: war. The box of matches on the mantel in that Highbury drawing room was one product, among a great many others carrying, somewhere upstream in its manufacture, a cost that never appeared on its label and rarely crossed the mind of the person striking the match. Understanding the Matchgirl story in its fullest context means understanding that their struggle was not an isolated tragedy successfully resolved by one specially well-documented strike. It was one visible instance, made visible specifically because Besant's article and the workers' own courage forced it into public view, of an arrangement that shaped the working lives of an enormous share of London's poorest residents, most of whom never received anything resembling the attention Fairfield Works received that particular July. None of this diminishes what Nell and her fellow workers actually achieved. If anything, it makes their achievement more remarkable rather than less, because they accomplished, through nothing more than their own numbers and their own refusal to keep suffering quietly, something that the far larger machinery of parliamentary inquiry and formal regulation had failed, across decades of documented evidence. But it is worth carrying this wider picture forward into the reflection that follows, because the true scale of what the Matchgirls were up against, and the true scale of how unusual their victory actually was against that backdrop, only becomes clear once you understand how many other workers in how many other trades never got the chance to walk out through a gate together at all. Keep that wider picture close at hand as we turn, in these final minutes, back toward Fairfield Works itself, and back toward the specific girl whose ordinary summer this account has spent so long inside. Step back now, far enough to see the whole of it at once, The wage book and the fines, the dipping pans and the yellow-stained hands, the toothache that became a swelling, that became, for some girls, a surgery, the statue in the yard, the article in the Link, the 1,400 women who walked out through a single gate on a single July morning. And a pattern begins to emerge that reaches well beyond Fairfield Works itself, one worth naming plainly before this account returns, in its final moments, to the drawing room where it began. The first pattern is the simplest to state and in some ways the hardest to sit with. The true cost of an ordinary object, a box of matches costing a fraction of a penny, was never calculated in the price printed on its label. It was calculated in a body, specifically and disproportionately the bodies of young working-class women, absorbed quietly enough that the person striking the match never needed to know it was happening at all. This was not unique to the match trade, and it did not end with it. Every era arranges its own version of this same quiet transfer, moving the true cost of convenience away from the person enjoying it and onto the person too poor, too young, or too powerless to refuse the work that provides it. Nell's aching jaw was, in this sense, not simply a personal misfortune. It was the specific physical location where an entire economic arrangement chose to settle its bill on a 14-year-old girl who had never been asked whether she consented to pay it. The second pattern concerns respectability and how comfortably it coexisted at Fairfield Works and in a great many similar institutions across this same era, with genuine and sustained cruelty. Bryant and May was not a disreputable firm hiding in the shadows of London's industrial underworld. It was a celebrated one, Quaker-founded, internationally decorated, its directors seated on charitable boards, its name printed with confidence on a product found in nearly every household in the country. That same firm fined teenage girls a shilling for a whispered word, fed them their lunch in a room thick with poison, and erected a public statue to a statesman, using money its own workers believed had come, at least in part, from their own wages. Respectability in this story was never a guarantee of decency. It was more often a form of camouflage, sturdy enough that it took a determined journalist, a courageous workforce, and a public willing to look past the polished surface to finally see what it had been concealing. The third pattern concerns knowledge, and the particular gap between what was scientifically understood and what was actually acted upon. Physicians had identified and documented phosphorus necrosis as an occupational hazard since the 1830 seconds, more than half a century before Nell ever walked through the gates of Fairfield Works. Safer manufacturing methods existed, proven and in active use by other countries, for decades before the practice was finally abandoned in Britain. This was never a story about ignorance. It was a story about a gap between knowing and doing, a gap that closed only when the cost of maintaining it, in public reputation, in shareholder confidence, in continued profitable operation, finally exceeded the cost of fixing it. Knowledge alone, this story makes clear, has never been sufficient to protect the people bearing the actual physical risk. Knowledge requires pressure behind it, sustained and specific, before it translates into anything resembling protection. Which leads to the fourth, and perhaps most important pattern of all, the one Nell herself lived through most directly. Silence, for as long as silence remained possible, was very often the only rational choice available to an individual worker facing a system this thoroughly stacked against her. But silence, multiplied across 1,400 workers simultaneously, was never the same thing as consent. And the moment that shared silence broke, all at once, in a single furious morning, it revealed a form of power that had been sitting dormant inside that workforce. done or recognized in some sense by the workers themselves until the moment they actually exercised it together. Nell had spent the better part of a year believing her own suffering was hers alone to carry quietly. What the strike taught her, and taught the entire country watching it unfold, was that the very qualities she had been led to regard as weaknesses, her youth, her poverty, her lack of any formal standing in the world beyond the factory gates, had never actually been the barrier to change that everyone, including Nell herself, had assumed them to be. There is a final observation worth making, quieter than the others, but no less important to how this story ought to be remembered. Change, when it finally came, arrived in pieces rather than all at once, and neither piece alone tells the full story on its own. The strike changed the wages and the fines and the room where a girl could eat her lunch immediately and completely within the span of 2 weeks through nothing more than the courage of the workers themselves. The chemistry that had caused the disease in the first place took 20 years longer to remove, requiring an international treaty and an act of parliament that no single factory's workforce, whatever its determination, could have forced into existence on its own. Both timelines are true simultaneously, and holding them together, rather than choosing the more satisfying one and discarding the other, is the only honest way to understand what the Matchgirls actually accomplished, and what remained for 2 more decades. Painfully unfinished, after they had already won everything a single strike could reasonably be expected to win. Return, now, to the drawing room in Highbury, to the woman by the lamp, to the small hiss of a struck match and the yellow flame steadying itself against the wick of her reading lamp. Nothing about that scene has changed since we left it. She still does not know the name Bryant, and May stands for beyond the confident red banner on the box. She still has no reason to picture a factory floor in Bow, a dipping room thick with the smell of garlic and something sharper beneath it, a 14-year-old girl pressing a wooden frame down into a shallow pan of pale paste for the several thousandth time that week. The box sits exactly where it sat before, unremarkable, cheerful, small enough to fit inside a closed fist. But you know now what that box actually contains, and knowing it changes the object even if the object itself has not moved an inch. Inside that small red and black container, alongside the 100 slender sticks of wood, sits the 14-hour day that produced them, gate to gate, 6 mornings out of every 7. It sits the 4 to 8 shillings a week that a girl like Nell earned for that day, and the shilling taken back from her for a whispered word about the weather, or a dropped match, or feet a foreman judged insufficiently clean by a standard he alone was permitted to set. It sits the smell of white phosphorus that never fully left a dipper's hair or her clothing, and the fine yellow dust that settled onto her bread at the very bench where she was required to eat it, because no separate room existed for a working-class girl's lunch until 1,400 of her fellow workers finally forced one into existence. It sits a toothache that a frightened 14-year-old told no one about for weeks, out of a fear considerably more rational than anyone reading a novel by lamplight would ever be asked to develop about their own body. And it sits, somewhere further back in the box's own history, the disease that gave phosphorus necrosis its plainer, more frightening name, the swelling, the discharge, the dead bones separating from the living, and in the worst and most advanced cases, a genuine and clinically documented glow, faint but real, visible in the full dark of a shared attic room, inside the mouth of a girl who had done nothing to deserve it beyond needing the wage badly enough to keep standing at her pan. None of this was printed on the label. None of it was meant to be. The entire function of that neat red banner, prize medals, the charitable board memberships, the statue of a statesman standing in the factory yard, was to ensure that the woman in the drawing room and the many thousands like her across the country never had cause to wonder what stood behind the confident type on the box in her hand. The performance of respectable British manufacturing was, in its own way, extraordinary in its thoroughness, a surface polished so carefully and so completely that it took a determined journalist, a small radical newspaper most of London had never heard of, and the collective courage of 1,400 women and girls willing to risk everything at once, to finally crack it open and let the actual contents show. And Nell, standing at the center of all of it, was never the porcelain figure. A comfortable imagination might prefer to picture, in her place, some idealized image of noble suffering, born silently and picturesquely for the benefit of a story told decades later. She was a person in a body that ached in specific, documented ways, doing work that specific, documented chemistry made truly dangerous, earning a specific, documented wage that specific, documented fines shrank further still. She was frightened, quite reasonably, of what a toothache might turn into if she let herself think about it too long. She was proud, in a way she had never expected to feel about anything connected to that factory, standing outside an office on Fleet Street, listening to a fellow worker read aloud the list of concessions the company had finally agreed to. She touched 2 fingers to a patch of chickweed growing wild in a gap in a brick wall on her walk home most evenings, a small private ritual that had nothing at all to do with matches or wages or phosphorus, and everything to do with a father she still missed and a life she was still, somehow, in the middle of building for herself, despite every obstacle that life had placed in front of her. It is worth imagining, gently, and without inventing more certainty than the historical record can actually support, what became of a girl like Nell in the years that followed the summer of 1888. Most of the real matchworkers whose documented lives inform this composite continued working in the trade for some years afterward, their wages and conditions measurably improved by the victory they had won together, their factory gradually shifting toward the safer red phosphorus process that finally removed the specific horror of phossy jaw from their daily working lives. Many married within their own East End communities, raised children in the same streets and courts where they themselves had grown up, and carried the story of that particular July with them for the rest of their lives. Told and retold at kitchen tables to daughters and granddaughters who grew up hearing about the summer their mother or grandmother had walked out of a factory alongside 1,399 other women and girls and had, against every reasonable expectation the world had given her. It is worth remembering, too, and this account would be dishonest, to leave out entirely, in its closing moments, that not every matchworker's story ended this gently. Phossy jaw continued to claim new cases across British match manufacturing for 2 more decades after the summer of the strike, in factories that had never experienced anything like the public scrutiny Fairfield Works received, among workers whose names never reached a newspaper column or a parliamentary inquiry. The specific composite girl this account has followed was, within the bounds of what the historical evidence can support, one of the more fortunate ones, spared the worst physical consequences that a considerable number of her real counterparts did not escape. Her story stands here, not because it was the most common outcome, but because it represents, honestly and without exaggeration, exactly what was truly at stake for every single girl standing at every single bench in that building, whichever way her own particular case ultimately turned. There is something worth carrying forward from this story that has nothing to do with pity, because pity was never the right response to offer these workers then or now. Nell and the women who stood beside her were not fragile figures waiting passively for rescue by a more educated outsider, whatever real help that outsider's assistance ultimately provided. They were resilient, resourceful, and quietly exhausted, carrying a physical and financial burden that would have broken a great many people less determined than they were. And when the moment finally arrived to act, they acted decisively, together, achieving something that London's existing labour movement had spent decades assuming unskilled working women simply were not capable of achieving. The dignity in this story does not belong to the drawing room. Comfortable and entirely blameless as the woman reading by lamplight actually was in her own ignorance of what her small box of matches had cost. The dignity belongs to Bow, to Fairfield Road, to a factory yard that 1,400 women and girls walked out of together on an ordinary Thursday morning in July, and to every single one of them who returned to work 2 weeks later, having proven to themselves and to a country that had never expected it, that they were never as powerless as the wage book had wanted them to believe. The candle by that reading chair in Highbury has burned low now, its wax pooling slowly around the base of the holder, the way candles do toward the end of a long evening. The woman closes her book, sets it on the side table beside the small red and black box, and reaches once more, without any particular thought, for the lamp switch that will end her evening properly. She has no reason to think of Bow tonight, or of Fairfield Road, or of a 14-year-old girl walking the last few streets toward 2 rented rooms off Wentworth Street, with her hands stained faintly yellow and her jaw for now still whole. But you can think of her if you choose to. The next time an ordinary flame catches on an ordinary stick of wood in your own hand. Somewhere behind every small forgettable convenience a comfortable life depends on, there is very often a person who paid for it in ways the label never printed, doing work considerably harder and considerably braver than anyone reading by lamplight was ever asked to notice. Nell noticed. She lived it every single day, and when the moment finally came to stop simply enduring it, she and 1,399 other women and girls chose, instead, to change it. The lamp goes dark. The box stays exactly where it was left, ordinary and small, and entirely undisturbed on the side table. Somewhere east of that quiet room in a city already settling into its own late hour, the truth of where that box came from goes on being exactly as true as it ever was, whether anyone in the drawing room happens to be thinking of it or not. Sleep well.